Hello, Dr. Stewart.
Dr. Hoover. Hello, Ed.
Hello. I've been typing your name so much that it's
Yeah,
you know. First of all, thank you for volunteering. Thank you for agreeing to the interview.
sure.
And
Glad to do it.
yeah, and just so we're on the same page, what I am doing is I am doing an interview for a global communications class, and the professor is going to, at the end of this semester, begin working for 2 years for the State Department. He's very concerned with global communications. He's been involved in certain activities in the Mideast, and very much involved in activities surrounding ISIS.
Hmm.
He does not take particularly, the course certainly does not, and in my experience with him, he does not take a particularly broad view of religion. And I thought that since I am interested in religious communications, this would be a perfect interview. Um, just wanted to get started. To begin, I noticed that a couple places in your writing you have said that there are no longer private conversations. And was wondering if you might be able to expand on that a bit.
Yeah, I'm referring there really specifically to religion, religious institutions, religious leaders that in the past thought that it would be possible to have a kind of bounded, protected space, which was controllable and which was a space that was really their inside community, them and their other clerics and their laity and that sort of thing, and they could think of the church or of the religion as this separated space in the middle of broader culture or broader society. And modern communication makes that impossible. That modern media scrutinize everything. Modern journalism looks into everything. And with social media and with other kinds of generations of communication and the way that we want to be constantly connected, constantly in touch and constantly in circulation, it just makes it impossible for religions to act that way anymore.
Following up on that, I know in a couple of your books you make reference to the fact that, maybe 40 years ago, it was a comfortable conviction among secular humanists that religion was going to wither away. And while it wasn't particularly reflected in their coverage of religion, they found it difficult and they didn't do much of it. Uh, Probably one of the most practical examples of the dangers of that was 911. I know that at that time I was working in PR. The whole thing was new to me, and I tend to keep up on things. Do you think that their coverage has now bridged that gap? Is on the way to that? Because some of the things that you said, namely that religion is hard to cover, is simply because it's so diverse. Where do you see that today?
Well, I don't know that it's improved a lot, and it's not. Well, let's see. Let me put it differently. I think the challenges are still there, and the assumptions tend still to be there. I think it's not so much a problem of. I guess I wouldn't lay it out to secular humanism as to a general sense on the part of intellectual elites that religion is something that is less and less important as we go into modern life. And there's evidence of. I think they see evidence of that in things like the decline of church attendance and membership, and the increase in the number of people on the poll and on the surveys that say they don't have any religious affiliation. Those numbers continue to change. There are more who don't claim a religion, and there are fewer who are attending services regularly. And so that sort of looks like the society is becoming more secular. So I think people, both in academic circles and in government policy circles and in journalism and the media, have felt that was the kind of the wave of the future. And I think they're still looking at those figures, and they're still saying, well, is religion as important as it used to be if people are if people are not attending church as much as they once did, and that sort of thing. And certainly it's the case in all religions. Mosque attendance is down in the Middle East, particularly among young people, and same in Judaism. So there's this sense that with younger generations, people are going to be less and less religious. And as you probably know from looking at my work in areas other than journalism, we've done a lot of research on how people use popular media, entertainment media, social media for religious and spiritual ends and explorations. And at the same time that it appears on some level like attendance, that religion's kind of fading away, on the other side, it seems like people have a great deal of interest in it, and there's an awful lot of religion that's kind of emerging even in new media and in social media. The other thing I'd say is I think you would, given the outcome of the election and the amount of conversation there's been about the curious contradiction of having a large number of evangelicals support someone who's so obviously not religious himself and who has accused of some real moral kinds of turpitude, and certainly younger evangelicals are raising that and criticizing their elders for supporting him. You would think that there'd be more attention to religion in coming months with the change in government, but the history would not say that will necessarily be the case, because we had a similar narrative in the 2004 election. I think it was. I remember. You may not remember, but there was a big conversation about the values voters were the ones who sort of put Bush over the top, and it was thought then that journalism and media studies people needed to pay more attention to religion to be able to anticipate that or explain that, and that went away pretty fast. They didn't turn into a big whole scale change. So I think there's still problems, and I'd say the coverage of the election, if we weren't talking about Trump victory now and what that meant in terms of certain constituencies supporting him who intermix religion with distasteful things like racism and et cetera, which is a bigger topic. I think we'd be looking back on the way the two candidates were covered, and I didn't think they were particularly well covered in terms of religion. The press tended to, there was some attention given to the fact that Trump had a evangelical support, and occasionally someone would mention Clinton's faith, and she quoted the Bible, and she spoke about her Methodist background really more than Obama did, and more than any candidate I can remember on the Democratic side since maybe Carter. She talked about religion, and that just didn't appear very much in the coverage. So I'm not optimistic that that's going to change very much.
Speaking, just going back to something that you said earlier. Correct me if I'm wrong, but as I was looking over your work, I seemed to see an evolution in your thought. In your earlier work, you started out talking, basically about, how media and religion interacted with each other and in fact changed each other. And then as you went on, you began talking about some convergences. And the last thing I read, you were talking about how media produces religion. Mm-hmm. And I kind of wanted to get some sense of how you came to that, and when you say that, what you mean.
Well, I think it's. I think you've identified the progression very well. That's exactly right. I would describe it that way myself. That I and other people. I'm not the only person who works in this area, though. As you know from your explorations, it's a relatively small field within communication and media studies. But I think many of us started out looking at phenomena like televangelism, and that was kind of seemed to be a case of what happens when religion goes on media. And then people wrote about religion journalism, and that's a case of what happens when the media study, frame religion. And then it occurred to me as I was looking at things, I was, as a media scholar, began doing more and more the kind of audience research that the culturalist turn in media studies encouraged us to do in the 80s and the 90s. And as you start hearing people's own voices and their own experience and their own explorations of values and identities and meanings and faith in relation to media, it becomes clear to you that it's not that case where the media are doing something to religion or religion doing something to media, but in the places where people are actually consuming media, they're kind of integrating what we think of as the secular and the sacred, or the entertainment and the non-entertainment, and they're going to entertainment media for religious and spiritual meanings, and they're making new kinds of sort of assumptions and associations there. And so it seemed like to be this case of kind of religion and media converging. And I think my new orientation, which is really talking about new kinds of religion being generated and formed, shifts the balance a bit over to the media and says it's not, media don't determine everything. It's not a deterministic sort of view, but with these new means and new platforms and new channels and new markets, there's more and more of a capacity that the media build for people to be able to construct their own meanings and their own identities and their own networks and their own associations and even their own congregations, and for settled religious institutions like congregations to sort of be remade by the capacities of mediation. So my colleague Heidi Campbell, who I'm sure you've read, talks about the fact of the kind of multi-site church, this multi-site megachurch being something that's kind of really derived out of the ability of media to kind of change the way religion is done. And on the more esoteric side, there are many, many examples of particularly young people using social media to generate new networks and new associations and new explorations and new ways of looking at faith and spirituality. And I think probably, I'd say that I want to claim it's kind of an empirical quest that's taken me through that sort of transition that you've talked about, from first looking at seeing evidence on the ground of this interaction in the case of televangelism and journalism in my early work, then to seeing what I was seeing in terms, or my colleagues and I were seeing in terms of the way people used media in their daily lives in relation to legacy media, which is mostly what we were doing in that period. And now with the new media environment, media are more and more what we think of as the media, are more and more the context where contemporary meanings and identities are worked out. And that's going to have an impact on religion, or it's going to have implications for religion like it does for everything else.
Speaking of that, as soon as you talk about new media, it leads me into what would you say about the impact of certainly the digital world? Among other things, that as you note in several places, media today tends to change space and time, and it tends to open up, not only new contacts, but the ability to find context and meaning, if you will, or frames for meaning, really within seconds, where once upon a time a lifetime wouldn't have helped you. Do you see things beyond that, or what implications are you seeing that are pertinent to this shifting?
Well, I think the most important factor is individual autonomy, and that individuals feel more and more responsible for and able to make their own choices and their own judgments. That's Protestantism, all the way back to the early modern period, but that's pushed ahead by a media environment or a media context where the sources of insight and what are legitimate frames or statements of the faith are in new contexts, and come in new ways, and they don't have to have the authoritative legitimation that they had in the past, because people feel like it's their role to make their own faith journey, to carry that, their own explorations, to make their own meanings, and they feel that the technology encourages them to feel that way. From studying media, we talk a lot about prosumption, circulations that are involved that aren't really the old, somebody's producing something and somebody's consuming something. It's everybody's kind of involved in producing new meanings and new things. So we're encouraged by the era, by the ideology or the rhetoric of the new media, to think that that's that's what we do, and that's the way we should act, and how we should carry out our explorations, and that then has a real implication. So that's where I look, and I think that logic of people being responsible and taking responsibility for their own faith journey, their own exploration, their own development of what they think of as the religious or spiritual part of their lives. I think that's the guiding logic of it. And other things like the instantaneity and the ubiquity, et cetera, those are things that make that possible, and people sort of play and work within those frames.
Okay.
And actually, you talked about sort of instantaneity, and I think ubiquity is another really important thing. That is, the media are everywhere. It's this totalizing kind of environment. People have a natural desire to connect with other people and to form, new communities and new discourses and new networks. And these new media encourage them to think in that way and do those kinds of things and find those conversations. And so where we're going to see these developments are in the way people themselves are negotiating their relationship to what media make possible for them in relation to their faith journey and their identities and their networks and associations.
The next is kind of a two-part question. If you were a politician, you'd pick the question you liked and ignore the other one. But I will ask them and see what you think. Okay. What does this individualism mean for organized religion? And when I say that, what I'm thinking about is the fact that in the past you've been able to go, say, get an endorsement from a church in politics, or you'd be able to sell insurance through a network of churches. And now, as the individual search for religion tends to stretch beyond that, it would seem to have economic impacts. But I'm also wondering if it doesn't have some worldwide implications for religion in general in the way we've thought about it. What would be your thoughts?
Yeah, I want to talk about both, so don't let me forget if I
Okay.
don't get them both covered. One of them is the whole idea of markets and kind of market reality. Think of the commodification of religion, and religion as a kind of participant in markets in our particular society and social structure. I think that's an important kind of thing, and those institutions or those structures don't have the same authority or the same meaning or the same ability to frame identities for people, and they don't have the same credibility that they had in the past. Okay. And this is something that I think is across the board. It's something that even the highly authoritative religions like Catholicism, structured religions, and what we used to think of as structured conservative churches, like Southern Baptist Convention or the Mormon Church, they are like everyone else suffering this decline in people's identification of their authority, and their authority is really what's under assault in the media age, because they have to exist. They have to live and have to exist in this broader media environment. It's harder to have their own local conversation. The only religions that really do that effectively are the ones that carefully police those boundaries, like the Amish, for instance. I'm Anabaptist myself, and so that's I understand that world and what the logic there is, and that involves a lot of effort to maintain a religion that's not totally absorbed by this larger set of cultural markets that religions find themselves in. And people since the 19th century, American Protestants, have felt that religion is kind of a marketplace, and you can choose the one that worked best for you, et cetera. And we're still in that kind of situation, and the media have made that market more obvious and more horizontal, and have forced these religions to be much more oriented toward making their own brands. And then the effect of that is a kind of leveling of their authority. They don't. It's harder to claim that you have any kind of unique claim on people when it's so obvious you're in this larger marketplace context. So think that's your first question. Could you repeat what the second one was?
Yeah, the second one was, what are the global implications of this kind of
Yeah.
both leveling and individuality?
Well, let me say a couple of things. I mean, the fact is that there are still structures, and there is still politics, and there is still national identity, and there still is things like ethnic conflict and ethnic suspicion. We know that from the current news. Those things are still out there. But we need to understand that there are limits to what I'm about to describe. But I'll describe what I think the underlying momentum of all this is in relation to religious institutions. And this applies mostly to the Abrahamic traditions, to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but because of they're unique in ways and distinct from the other religions. But I think for all three of them, they all face the same kinds of pressure, the same pressure from this that we're talking about. That is the pressure over authority and the ability of traditional authority in those religious settings, however it is expressed. Some are more institutional, like Christianity is much more institutional. In Islam is less institutional. It's much more based on clerical, scholarly, distributed clerical, scholarly authority in different communities, etc. But they all face this crisis over authority. The idea that they started in modernity. They came. Judaism didn't, but Christianity and Islam both did, and they grew with modernity, and they grew with the kind of rise of the individual and individual autonomy and our kind of humanistic principles, particularly in the West. Similar principles, I think, in past years in Islam, particularly in the European part of Islam in Spain, etc., where the idea was the individual has more power and more authority, and that has always led to tension within those organizations. And they have tried to, they've always tried to sort of organize the landscape for themselves. And that's involved controlling, among other things, the message, and controlling access to the message, and controlling legitimation of the message, like who has the right to say this is the authentic and this isn't. And they all face an era now where they can no longer control that, because individuals across the world feel like they have a right to make their own assumptions and in some ways can do a better job of articulating the message. In Islam, for instance, Amr Khalid, the global televangelist, is extremely successful because he's very good. He's a very good speaker. He knows how to do media. He has no clerical training whatsoever, but his authority comes from being a media figure who's very good at doing media. And so Islam faces that kind of problem. It's also, in a way, Islam has a different kind of challenge because there hasn't been a central, aside from, in the case of Shia, maybe the theological center of Qom, and in the case of Sunni Islam, Al-Azhar University in Cairo, that have been the center of theological formation, at least in modernity and within Islam. But they're not as powerful or as influential or as systematically connected with the faith as theological centers in Christianity and Judaism are. So Islam, in a way, is a little more diverse and a little more diffuse than the other faiths. And I guess the other way that media affects religious authority is through through globalization and several of the impacts of globalization, and probably the most important one is transnational identities and the flows of peoples. And you have more and more migration going on around the world. Economic migration primarily. We hear about refugee migration, but if you think about the globe today, we're facing a time where you have layered migrations of once separate national and regional and identities, continental identities that are sort of intermixed. The U.S. is a mixture of Asian and et cetera. And those people, the modern media, make it possible for you to have kind of a multi-layered sense of your grounding, and all of that makes religion in a way, something that's much more something that's up to the individuals, because they then make their own legitimate judgments about who they are and what they believe in and who they want to associate with and what kinds of things they want to produce and say. And I just think that is something that all religions face. Now, there are ways religion can fight that. They can, you can fight a rearguard action against this kind of social change and cultural change. But I think it's inevitable that religions will have to learn to live with much, much greater autonomy and autonomous practice on the part of their adherents than they were used to in the past.
Well, the first thing that strikes me from my background is it's going to really affect their budgets.
Oh yes. Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, let me add one more thing, which I think is probably important. Is my primarily, as I said, I'm Anabaptist. My background is in terms of the churches that I associate with and where I speak and that sort of thing. They're mostly Protestant congregations, and I've tended to be more active with the theological schools and the congregations, et cetera, what we call the mainline traditions.
Okay.
And what's going on there is that, yes, there's a decline across the board in membership, et cetera, in those congregations and attendance. Evangelicalism is also suffering a decline, as I said before, but the mainline's ahead in terms of that. But there are strong congregations, and the ones that are strong and booming and growing are the ones that are able to build on this idea of individual autonomy, to engage people in a process at the congregational level. So the denominations are fading; they don't have the authority that they used to have. Where meaning and authority and the cultivation of what the tradition means is happening is in these congregations where individuals feel closer to what's going on and they feel like they're more involved in making this thing work. And so I think that's the future, even for Protestantism in the United States, and then eventually I think Catholicism will experience that as well, but not as soon as Protestantism does.
Well, that leads me to another question, since we're kind of talking about where things are trending. When you look at ISIS right now, one of the things that you hear about them is their adroit use of social media. And I've been trying to place them in a larger context, and I don't know if that's a valid effort or if there's simply some sort of one-off that provides me with what I call the Patty Hearst option. Patty Hearst was just this blip in history that everybody looked at, and it meant absolutely nothing for the society in general. And I'm wondering if ISIS has some sort of global implications, or whether it is simply this odd confluence in the beginning of the 21st century.
I don't think there'll be more ISISes, if that's an implication of what you're saying. I think it's not insignificant, and it's not going away. And part of the reason it's not going away is because it actually kills people. And when anyone who can kill people, whether you're a despotic dictator or a president who's jailing journalists or whatever, you can in the name of religion, which is happening in Turkey, for instance, and it has happened in other countries in the name of religion as well. You can make your will known outside of this context of kind of the media you use and the mediation that happens. And I think, as is the case with the Arab Spring developments, it is an interaction. The technology is not going to make a certain kind of thing happen. The thing happens. It's a multiplier effect. It's an additive effect. It's layered into the other kinds of contexts. And so I think we have to look at every case on its own terms. And in a way, ISIS is unique because you have both a military operation that actually has had actual military success, yes. And opportunistically seized territory. I mean, it but into a power vacuum, basically.
They took land that nobody wanted, really.
Yeah, exactly. And they were able to say, well, but at the same time, they're a media phenomenon, not just for their use of social media. I mean, I think they're given that, but they were also very good at crafting a media imaginary, that is to say, a mediated sense of a kind of apocalyptic vision that prophesied this struggle, epical struggle between the West and Islam, that they prophesy happens somewhere in the middle, in near their territory. I'm not sure. I don't remember exactly where the valley where this battle is supposed to take place.
Yeah, I thought it was in northern Syria, but go ahead.
Yeah. And so but in the same way that a millenarian, fundamentalists will, they have this kind of crafted vision, and you can see how media can be very useful in that kind of thing, particularly if you're pretty sophisticated in the use of the media of the day, and ISIS has been very good at that. So you can't really explain ISIS without media. It's not, it wouldn't have done what it's done, and it wouldn't have had the effects it's had without media. But the media aren't the whole reason why it's done what it's done and why it's been successful. Media certainly enabled things like both making recruiting more accessible, just through the political economy of kind of online communication and distribution of things and travel or travel advice and stuff like that, very mundane online things, but also because they've been able to craft a kind of narrative and have a consistent articulation of that narrative from one medium and one frame and one context to the next. Now, people such as my colleague Nabil Chaibi at CU are beginning to look at the reaction against ISIS and the way in which Muslims, anti-ISIS Muslims, are also now using media to create and craft an alternative discourse to attempt to confront ISIS and challenge it, also using the same media techniques and things. So, and I think that's what we're looking at in the future. We're going to more and more see the media as this very important actor in global religious and political affairs. We don't know where yet. It's also new in a kind of way. We don't know exactly what the lessons are going to be from all of this, but that's the future we're looking at, I think, in terms of media religion.
My final question. Yep. When you talked about media producing religion, I tried to think to myself whether you could say the same thing about media producing politics or media producing economics. And for me, I in part, I think you kind of started to answer my question here when you pointed out that ISIS was more than the media. It was a military. And at the same time, I was trying to think, is religion simply a business of symbolism and hope, which certainly is something that the media can respond to? It's kind of, in some senses, what they are. Or do you see the media now producing politics and producing economics in somewhat of the same way?
Well, that's very interesting. I've thought a lot, I get this frequently, and occasionally I think myself, it occurs to me to think, well, to what extent do I want to say that religion is unique? And
sui generis.
Yeah. And my religious studies colleagues hate it when I say religion's unique. So among things,
well, that's interesting because mine say just the opposite.
They're not happy with that idea because of this whole history of us misunderstanding religion because we had an essential definition of what it is. I mean, that's essentially what the problem with the secularization hypothesis. The people who fell victim to the idea of secularization did so because they had this fixed, very clear formula for what a religion was, and if this aspect of it, like attendance and identity, began to deteriorate, then that meant the whole thing was going away. Yeah. And so we've got, you do want to be careful about saying how unique religion is. Maybe for historical reasons, in terms of cultural history, I'd say religion is maybe uniquely produced by media because the kinds, where we are at this point in history, the affordances of media for exploration, for building imaginaries, I mean, good ones and bad ones, the ISIS imaginary as well as imagined normative ideas ideal spaces in life and idealized futures, the media have those kinds of abilities that interact in a different kind of way with religious meaning and identity and practice than media interact with economic identity and meaning. I think it's a little different now. So is religion uniquely produced? I think there's a way in which the media do produce politics. I mean, you could certainly say this election, the fact that so much of it was so much of the momentum in it was in social media, and the legacy media have had such a difficult time legitimating or codifying the social media discourse. They tend to give the social media a little more credit than they deserve, and attribute to them more power and influence than than the social media actually deserve. But nonetheless, that's then become self-generating and things that
self-fulfilling and
not to be real events and stuff. Okay. So, in a way, politics has been produced by media, at least in recent years. So, I'm not sure I'll make a distinction. I think if I was going to try to make a distinction, those would be the kinds of things I'd look at.
Okay. Well, that's my final question.
Okay.
I do want to thank you for your time.
Sure.
And have yourself a very happy holiday season.
Thank you. You too. And if you would not mind, I think my colleagues might want to have. You made a recording of this?
Yes, I did.
They might want to have the recording back in Boulder, if you wouldn't mind.
Not a problem at all.
We could talk to you about how we want to use it, whether they put excerpts on the website or something. I don't know. But
this came together well for my purposes, and I want to thank you for your time.
Sure. And I'll look forward to seeing what you come up with.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Hey, thanks a lot. You have a good Thanksgiving too.
You too.
Bye.
Goodbye.